The Sheriff's Choice, From Chains to Freedom. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker was a man shaped by his town. The small rural community of Pine Ridge had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, their families, and even their habits. The town didn't have much crime, but the kind that did happen left a big mark. Daniel had grown up here, walked its streets as a boy, and now, decades later, patrolled them with the same sense of belonging and responsibility. Every morning he would lace up his boots, straighten his uniform, and step into the sheriff's office, a place that smelled of polished wood, old coffee, and the faint tang of leather from worn-out chairs. It was a place that carried decades of history and decisions, some that had changed lives, some that had left scars. From the outside, Daniel seemed like a man who had it all under control. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair touched by gray and a calm, authoritative presence. Children would wave at him as he drove past, and adults treated him with a mix of respect and trust. He had earned his position honestly, starting as a deputy in his 20s, learning the ropes, and gradually working his way up. By the time he became sheriff, he knew the townspeople almost as well as they knew him. He knew who had a temper, who had a kind heart, who struggled silently behind closed doors, and who could be relied upon when life threw its challenges. Yet underneath that confident exterior, Daniel carried a quiet restlessness. Despite his success and the respect he commanded, he often found himself reflecting late at night on the limitations of his role. He had taken an oath to uphold the law, but he had begun to notice that sometimes the law alone wasn't enough. People weren't just criminals or victims. They were individuals shaped by circumstances, by poverty, neglect, and chance. Some decisions he had made in his early years as a lawman haunted him. There were faces of young people he had sent to jail, young men and women who could have been guided differently, given the right opportunities. He sometimes wondered if in those moments he had chosen the easier path instead of the better one. The sheriff's life was a mix of routine and unpredictability. Most days it was paperwork, routine patrols, and community events, a chance to shake hands, offer advice, or just share a friendly word. But then there were days that shook him to his core, days when reality reminded him that life was fragile, unfair, and complicated. It was one of those days that began an unexpected chapter in his career. A call came early one Monday morning, as the fog still hung low over the pine trees lining the streets. A young teenager, Marcus Hayes, had been caught in a situation that was part accident, part misunderstanding, and part bad luck. He was facing charges serious enough to send him into the county detention system, but as Daniel read the reports and listened to the details, he felt a twinge of unease that went beyond his usual professional concern. There was something about Marcus's case that made him pause. Marcus was 16, tall for his age, with a quiet demeanor that contrasted sharply with the trouble he found himself in. His family was struggling. His father had left years ago, and his mother, although loving, worked long hours just to keep the household afloat. He had older siblings, some who had already made poor choices and had faced the consequences. Marcus wasn't perfect, but he was a product of a world that hadn't been kind to him. And now, through no entirely malicious intent of his own, he was being judged by a system that didn't always take the person behind the mistake into account. The sheriff remembered seeing him once before, months ago, in a school assembly. Marcus had been quiet but attentive, raising his hand when asked thoughtful questions, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Daniel had filed the image away subconsciously as one of those small, fleeting impressions. Now, seeing Marcus in a different context, under suspicion, surrounded by law enforcement officers and with a fear that showed in every line of his face, Daniel felt something stir in his conscience. It was familiar, too familiar. He thought of his cousin James, who had grown up in Pine Ridge just like Marcus, a boy with potential, intelligence, and charm, but who had made mistakes that the system punished harshly. James had ended up in prison years ago, and Daniel had never fully forgiven himself for not finding a way to help him before it was too late. The memory was a sharp, unwelcome reminder of what could happen if the same patterns repeated themselves. Daniel's office became a place of quiet reflection over the following days. He read through the police reports multiple times, analyzing each detail, each witness statement. Something about the case didn't sit right. Some evidence seemed circumstantial. Some testimonies conflicted with others, and yet the weight of the charges loomed heavily. The townspeople, always observant, were beginning to murmur. Some saw Marcus as just another troubled youth, another statistic. Others were sympathetic to his situation, seeing him as someone who needed guidance, not punishment. Daniel felt the tension of the entire community pressing on his shoulders. He began visiting Marcus's home, not as an officer enforcing authority, but as a man seeking understanding. He saw a small house, modest but full of care, with photographs of family moments lining the walls. Marcus's mother spoke with honesty and vulnerability, explaining the struggles she faced trying to keep her children on the right path. She didn't excuse Marcus's actions, but provided context that made Daniel question the fairness of immediate punishment. It was one thing to enforce the law. It was another to truly serve justice. Daniel realized that his role could involve more than arrests and paperwork. It could involve guidance, mentorship, and perhaps even intervention before life's mistakes became permanent. Walking through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge that evening, Daniel reflected on his life. The familiar rhythm of the town, the rustle of pine trees in the wind, and the distant laughter of children at play, all contrasted with the storm inside him. He had always believed in doing his duty, in following rules and upholding the law. But duty alone didn't guarantee fairness or humanity. The more he thought about Marcus, the more he realized that this case could challenge everything he had learned in his career. It wasn't just a decision about a teenager. It was a decision about what kind of man he wanted to be as a sheriff and as a human being. For Daniel, this was the beginning of a journey that would test his principles, his courage, and his empathy. The ordinary world of routine patrols and office paperwork had ended the moment Marcus walked into his office. From that point onward, Daniel's choices would not only affect the life of a single boy but could also ripple through the community, reshaping perceptions, trust, and the very meaning of justice in Pine Ridge. He understood that what lay ahead would not be easy. Every decision carried weight, every action had consequence, and every conversation mattered. Yet deep down, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could make a difference, not just for Marcus, but for the town and for himself. As night fell over Pine Ridge, Daniel sat alone in his office, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the stacks of reports before him. The quiet hum of the town outside was a reminder of life continuing, unaware of the decisions that were quietly forming inside these walls.
He looked at a photograph on his desk, one of his younger self standing with his cousin James, smiling in a moment of innocence.
He had a chance now to rewrite a story, to offer someone else a chance he had once failed to give. It was a burden and an opportunity, heavy but compelling. Daniel knew that from this point onward, there would be no turning back to the comfort of routine. The ordinary world had changed, and so had he. The morning Marcus Hayes was brought to the sheriff's office felt colder than usual. A thin layer of frost covered the town, making the streets sparkle under the weak winter sun. Daniel Whitaker watched from his office window as the patrol car rolled to a stop, and Marcus stepped out, his hands cuffed and his head slightly lowered. There was a heaviness in Marcus's walk, a quiet tension that spoke louder than words ever could. Daniel felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the kind that came when a situation was not black or white, when the lines between right and wrong blurred under the weight of life's complexity. Marcus was charged with stealing a car, a minor crime in the grand scheme of law enforcement, but serious enough to threaten to derail a young life. The reports said he had been caught driving without permission, late at night, on a road far from his home. But Daniel knew that circumstances often told a different story than the official files suggested. He had seen firsthand how desperation, fear, and a lack of guidance could lead someone to make decisions that seemed reckless, yet were rooted in survival. Marcus's situation tugged at something deep within Daniel, a memory of his cousin James, whose bright future had been overshadowed by a single bad choice. The first time Daniel spoke to Marcus, it was in the quiet interrogation room at the sheriff's office. The walls were bare, cold, and slightly worn, but there was a sense of gravity in the air that demanded attention. Marcus looked small in the seat, despite being taller than Daniel, and his eyes flickered nervously, darting between the sheriff, the door, and the floor. Daniel knew he had to approach carefully, He wasn't just a lawman in this room. He was a human being faced with another human being's potential and mistakes. "Marcus," Daniel began, keeping his voice calm but steady, "I need you to tell me what happened." Marcus swallowed hard and began recounting the events, stuttering slightly at first, then speaking more freely as he gained confidence. His story was simple yet complex. He had borrowed the car from a neighbor without asking, intending to return it quickly, but circumstances spiraled out of control. The neighbor had reported it stolen, a misunderstanding had escalated, and suddenly Marcus found himself facing serious charges. Daniel listened quietly, noting the fear, confusion, and honesty in Marcus's voice. There was no arrogance, no attempt to mislead, just a boy caught in a web that was partly his own making, and partly the result of forces beyond his control. After the conversation, Daniel sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The law was clear, but life was messy. The reports painted Marcus as a criminal, but Daniel saw something different, a young boy with a chance to learn, grow, and make better choices if given guidance instead of punishment. He knew the system rarely allowed for that kind of nuance. Decisions were often made in black and white, without regard for the gray areas that defined real life. For Daniel, Marcus's case had become a mirror reflecting all the mistakes, oversights, and failures he had witnessed over the years. That afternoon, Marcus's mother came to the office. She was exhausted, her eyes red from worry, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. She spoke to Daniel directly, explaining the challenges her family had faced. Long hours at work, a lack of local resources, and past mistakes had all shaped Marcus's life. She didn't ask for special treatment. She simply wanted someone to understand her son, to see him not as a criminal but as a child who had made a mistake. Daniel listened, absorbing every word. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder than ever. Here was a mother pleading not just for leniency, but for justice in its truest form, a chance for her son to grow instead of being lost to a system that might break him. Over the next few days, Daniel began digging deeper into the case. He revisited witness statements, cross-checked timelines, and even spoke to the neighbor who had reported the car stolen. Every conversation revealed layers that were not captured in the official reports. Marcus's actions were not malicious. They were impulsive, born of inexperience, fear, and a lack of guidance. Daniel started to see the outlines of a larger problem. The system was designed to punish, not to rehabilitate, and young people like Marcus were often caught in the cracks. The sheriff's colleagues began to notice his unusual focus on the case. Some were skeptical, warning him not to get too involved, arguing that the law needed to be enforced without exceptions. Others were quieter but supportive, recognizing that Daniel was grappling with a moral challenge that went beyond standard procedure. He felt the tension of divided opinion, the pressure of public expectation, and the fear that any choice he made could have lasting consequences. Yet he could not shake the feeling that turning away, following routine without thought, would be a betrayal, not just to Marcus, but to himself. Daniel also began spending time outside the office, walking through Marcus's neighborhood, observing the environment in which the boy had grown up. He saw worn streets, small houses, and kids playing in empty lots, but he also saw resilience, care, and community. He realized that Marcus's misstep was not a reflection of bad character but of circumstances and limited opportunities. The sheriff understood that justice was not just about enforcing rules, but about creating paths for people to make better choices. Marcus's situation demanded more than punishment. It demanded guidance, mentorship, and a chance to learn from mistakes without being destroyed by them. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, the sun setting behind the hills, painting the room in shades of gold and orange. He reviewed Marcus's case files again, thinking through every detail, every conversation, every witness statement. The decision he faced was not easy. Uphold the law strictly and risk ruining a young life, or bend the rules, risk his reputation, and give a boy a chance at freedom and growth. It was the kind of moral dilemma that could define a person's character, a decision that weighed heavily on his conscience. The turning point came when Daniel remembered James, his cousin. James had been bright, curious, and full of promise, much like Marcus. But James had made a mistake, a single choice that led to years in prison. and Daniel had never fully forgiven himself for failing to intervene, for not finding a way to help before it was too late. Marcus was a second chance, a reminder that the right choice required courage, empathy, and a willingness to face criticism. Daniel realized that his role as sheriff was not just to enforce the law, but to embody justice in its fullest sense, to balance rules with humanity, and to act when the system failed to see the person behind the crime. In the days leading to the trial, Daniel spent long hours preparing. He met with social workers, school counselors, and mentors, seeking solutions that would allow Marcus to take responsibility without being destroyed by the consequences. He drafted plans for counseling, mentorship, and community involvement. Every step reinforced the sheriff's belief that Marcus deserved a chance, that the law could be tempered with compassion without undermining its purpose. The closer the trial approached, the heavier the weight of expectation became. Daniel knew that his choice would be scrutinized by the town, colleagues, and legal authorities, but he also knew that ignoring the moral imperative would leave a mark on his conscience he could never erase. When the day of the hearing arrived, Daniel walked into the courtroom with a mixture of determination and unease. He saw Marcus sitting quietly, his hands folded, eyes wary but trusting. The sheriff understood that what he said and did in the next hours could alter the trajectory of the boy's life forever. This was more than a case. It was a test of character, courage, and the kind of justice that went beyond rules on paper. Daniel's heart raced, not out of fear for himself, but out of concern for the life of someone who, under different circumstances, might have been lost to the system entirely. As he took his place to speak, Daniel felt the full weight of the turning point he had reached. The choice before him was not easy, but it was clear. He could either follow the path of certainty, enforce the law strictly, and risk destroying a young life, or he could follow the path of conscience, guided by empathy, understanding, and the belief that people could change. Marcus was counting on him, and the memory of James reminded him of what could happen if he failed. In that moment, Daniel realized that being sheriff was about more than badges, rules, and authority. It was about making choices that mattered, choices that reflected the best of humanity. After the hearing, Marcus returned home under the watchful eye of his mother. Though he had not yet faced sentencing, the uncertainty of his future weighed heavily on him. Every step into a small house felt like walking on thin ice. The walls, lined with family photos, offered comfort and familiarity, yet they also reminded him of how easily things could go wrong. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn wood surface as if it could give him answers. His mother poured a cup of tea and set it in front of him without saying a word. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken fear and hope. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Whitaker could not escape the shadow of the case. Even after leaving the courthouse, the boy's image remained etched in his mind. Daniel's days became consumed by thought, research, and careful planning. Every decision seemed to carry double weight. He had to ensure that Marcus was treated fairly while protecting himself and his reputation. Colleagues began to notice his unusual focus. Some quietly criticized him, whispering that he was getting too involved, that he should follow standard procedure and let the law take its course. Others offered support but remained cautious, afraid of drawing attention. Daniel felt the tension mounting like a storm gathering on the horizon, each cloud heavier than the last. Daniel spent long evenings in his office, reading and rereading every report, interview, and statement. He cross-checked witness accounts, visited locations mentioned in Marcus's story, and spoke with people who knew the family. Every interaction revealed more complexity: the pressures Marcus faced at home, the influence of older peers, and the lack of structured opportunities in the town. Daniel realized that Marcus's actions were less about rebellion and more about circumstance, desperation, and the absence of guidance. A sheriff felt a mixture of frustration and determination. Frustration at a system that punished without understanding. Determination to find a path that could save a young life. At the same time, Marcus struggled with his own feelings of guilt and fear. He knew he had made a mistake, but he could not shake the sense of being trapped in a situation that felt larger than himself. His friends had begun to avoid him, afraid of association, and even classmates whispered when he walked by. The boy felt isolated, abandoned not by choice but by circumstance. At school, teachers treated him with a mixture of suspicion and pity, which only deepened his shame. Marcus wanted to be good, to make the right choices, but he had limited tools to navigate the pressure and judgment he faced. Every day seemed like a battle against forces he could not fully control. Daniel noticed the subtle signs of Marcus's struggle during his visits. The sheriff would see Marcus slouch in his chair, avoiding eye contact or muttering answers under his breath when asked a question. Yet beneath the surface, there were glimpses of intelligence, curiosity, and resilience. Daniel began to understand that Marcus was capable of growth if given guidance, structure, and support. The sheriff knew that rehabilitation required patience, careful planning, and often personal sacrifice. He was prepared to take those steps even if it meant stepping outside the familiar boundaries of his professional role. The tension between duty and conscience grew more pronounced. Daniel faced questions from the public, colleagues, and legal authorities who doubted his judgment. Some accused him of favoritism, others of bending the law too far. Daniel could feel his reputation, earned through decades of service, starting to wobble under the scrutiny. Yet, each criticism only strengthened his resolve. He reminded himself that justice was not simply following rules, it was understanding context, showing empathy, and giving people a chance to change. Marcus's life hung in the balance, and Daniel knew that failing to act could have irreversible consequences. In the quiet moments Daniel reflected on his own life. He remembered his cousin James, whose bright future had been lost to a single mistake, and he thought about the young people he had arrested over the years, some of whom had returned to crime repeatedly. The sheriff understood that systemic problems often trapped individuals in cycles that were difficult to escape. Marcus's case was not just a legal challenge, it was a moral test, an opportunity to break a cycle before it became permanent. Daniel began to view his role differently, not just as an enforcer of rules, but as a guide, mentor, and protector of potential. Marcus, meanwhile, struggled with feelings of helplessness. Each night he lay awake, thinking about what the future held. He worried about prison, about disappointing his mother, about losing the chance to be someone he could be proud of. He also felt the pressure of the town's judgment, sensing that neighbors, friends, and classmates had already labeled him in ways that would take years to undo. Marcus began to withdraw, retreating into books, small hobbies, and quiet walks around the neighborhood. These moments of reflection, though solitary, gave him glimpses of hope and clarity. He realized that he had the ability to choose differently moving forward, but only if given the opportunity. Daniel recognized these signs and sought ways to strengthen Marcus's resolve. He arranged meetings with mentors, connected him with community programs, and encouraged him to participate in small acts of responsibility and leadership. Each step required careful negotiation, trust building, and patience. The sheriff knew that one wrong word or gesture could undo all progress. Marcus responded gradually, showing small improvements, completing tasks on time, taking advice seriously, and expressing interest in learning skills that could help him in the future. These small victories strengthened Daniel's belief that the boy was capable of change. As the trial date approached, the pressure intensified for both men. Marcus worried about every detail, anticipating judgment and punishment. Daniel faced sleepless nights drafting plans, consulting with legal advisors, and weighing options for a path that could offer justice while fostering growth. The sheriff often walked alone at night, reflecting on the delicate balance between law and morality. He knew that any misstep could have consequences not just for Marcus, but for the town's perception of the justice system and his own career. The weight of responsibility felt almost unbearable. Yet Daniel pressed forward, guided by empathy, experience, and a sense of moral duty. The struggle also revealed hidden strengths in both the sheriff and the boy. Daniel's dedication and willingness to look beyond surface-level judgments inspired Marcus to consider his own potential. Marcus began to see that mistakes did not have to define him, that change was possible with effort, guidance, and the right support. At the same time, Daniel learned that courage was not simply about facing criminals or enforcing laws. It was about taking difficult moral stands, challenging the status quo, and sometimes risking personal comfort for the greater good. Through this period, the community watched closely. Some criticized, some sympathized, and some quietly supported. The tension in Pine Ridge reflected a universal truth. Justice is complicated, and the choices of those in authority can ripple far beyond a single case. Daniel and Marcus were both tested in ways they had never imagined. Every decision, every word, every interaction carried weight. Marcus's daily life became a series of lessons in responsibility, patience, and trust. Daniel's life became a study in moral courage, empathy, and the power of second chances. By the time the trial arrived, both men had been shaped by the struggle. Marcus had grown in confidence, understanding, and resilience. Daniel had found clarity in his role as both lawman and human being. The tension, the sleepless nights, the moral wrestling, all of it culminated in a moment of anticipation and hope. What would happen next was uncertain, but both understood that the journey itself had already changed them. Marcus was no longer just a boy facing charges. He was someone on the edge of transformation, guided by a man willing to risk everything to do what was right. The story of the descent, the struggle that tested both the boy and the sheriff, was far from over, but it had already begun to show the power of empathy, moral courage, and patience. It revealed that real life was rarely simple and that growth often came through trials, challenges, and careful guidance. For Marcus, every day of struggle became a lesson in responsibility and self-awareness. For Daniel, every sleepless night became a lesson in the complexities of justice and the realization that authority was most powerful when tempered by humanity. The morning of the trial arrived with an unusual stillness in Pine Ridge, the streets, normally alive with the sounds of children playing and neighbors greeting each other, were quiet. People seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker parked his car a few blocks from the courthouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on him. Every decision he had made over the past weeks, every meeting with Marcus, every late-night reflection, had led to this moment. The outcome would not just affect the boy, but would ripple through the town and perhaps even define the sheriff himself. Marcus arrived at the courthouse with his mother, his face pale but determined. The boy had changed since the first day he entered the sheriff's office. He walked a little taller, held his head higher, and seemed more aware of the weight of his actions. Still, fear lingered in his eyes, the fear of judgment, of punishment, and of failing those who believed in him. Daniel met his gaze briefly, offering a small nod of encouragement. It was a silent message. I am here for you. We will face this together. Marcus took a shaky breath and stepped into the courtroom, feeling the weight of countless eyes on him. The courtroom was tense. Friends, neighbors, and local media filled the seats, all waiting to witness the outcome. The judge presided with quiet authority, and the prosecutor, a woman known for her strict adherence to the law, presented the case with precision. She recounted the facts clearly. Marcus had taken a car without permission, and under the law, he could face serious consequences. Her voice was firm but not cruel, her words emphasizing the importance of accountability. Daniel listened carefully, noting the reactions of the audience, the subtle expressions on Marcus's face, and the weight of expectation hanging over everyone. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he rose from his seat slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's usual calm presence was tinged with something more: intensity, urgency, and a quiet determination. He began to speak not just as a lawman, but as someone who had seen the complexities of life and the consequences of rigid justice. He recounted his observations of Marcus, the circumstances that had led to his actions, and the potential for growth and rehabilitation. Daniel spoke of the boy's character, his intelligence, and the small but meaningful steps he had taken toward responsibility. Every word was measured, thoughtful, and grounded in truth. Daniel also addressed the systemic challenges Marcus had faced: the lack of guidance, the pressures of his family situation, and the limited opportunities available in Pine Ridge. He explained that while the law needed to be respected, justice required more than punishment. It required understanding, compassion, and a chance for the individual to learn and grow. His voice carried conviction, and there was a sense in the room that something important was being revealed, something that went beyond the details of the crime itself. As he spoke, Daniel noticed subtle shifts in the courtroom. Some faces that had been skeptical now softened. Some murmurs of doubt gave way to quiet nods of acknowledgement. Even the prosecutor paused, considering the points Daniel raised, the layers of complexity he had highlighted. The sheriff's words were not an excuse for wrongdoing. They were a call for justice that balanced accountability with humanity. He argued that Marcus's potential for growth and contribution to the community outweighed the need for strict punitive measures, and that alternative approaches could achieve both justice and rehabilitation. The turning point came when Daniel presented a detailed plan for Marcus's future. He suggested community service, counseling and mentorship programs that would provide structure, guidance, and positive role models. Daniel emphasized that this approach would allow Marcus to take responsibility for his actions while learning important life skills and contributing meaningfully to the community. He spoke with clarity and passion, showing that he had thought deeply about the boy's situation and the best path forward. Marcus listened quietly, absorbing every word. He felt a mixture of relief, hope, and nervous anticipation. For the first time, he sensed that his fate might not be determined solely by punishment, but by a chance to prove himself, to show that he could make better choices. His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, and he returned the gesture, feeling a connection that grounded him in the moment. The sheriff's presence and words had given him a sense of agency he had not felt in weeks, and it reminded him that he was not alone in facing the challenges ahead. The judge, a man known for fairness and careful consideration, listened attentively to every argument. He asked questions, seeking clarity on the plan Daniel proposed and the likelihood of its success. Daniel answered patiently, providing examples of Marcus's progress, the support systems in place, and the community resources that could help ensure accountability. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge weighed the options, the balance of law and justice hanging delicately in the air. Finally, the judge made his decision. He acknowledged the seriousness of Marcus's actions but emphasized the potential for growth and rehabilitation. The alternative sentence was approved. Community service, structured counseling, and participation in mentorship programs designed to teach responsibility and life skills. Marcus would not face incarceration, but he would be held accountable in a way that encouraged personal development and positive contribution. The words hung in the room, a mixture of relief, hope, and cautious optimism. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel and Marcus stepped outside. The air felt lighter, almost as if the tension that had hung over the past weeks had lifted. Marcus turned to the sheriff, eyes wide with gratitude and wonder. "Thank you," he said softly, almost unable to find the words to express what he felt. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and encouragement. "You earned this, Marcus." "Now it's your turn to show what you can do," he replied, his voice steady but filled with warmth. In the days that followed, the sheriff continued to work closely with Marcus and his family. He checked in regularly, ensuring that the boy was following through with his responsibilities and receiving the guidance he needed. The mentorship programs became a source of learning, support, and inspiration for Marcus, helping him discover skills, interests, and a sense of purpose. The community, initially skeptical, began to notice the boy's progress and offered quiet encouragement, showing that second chances could foster real change. Daniel, meanwhile, reflected on the experience and the choices he had made. The trial had tested his courage, judgment, and moral compass in ways he had never imagined. By speaking honestly, advocating for fairness, and balancing accountability with empathy, he had helped a young life change direction. Yet he also knew that the journey was far from over. Marcus's future depended on continued effort, guidance, and responsibility. The sheriff understood that the real work was just beginning, the work of mentorship, support, and the daily practice of making the right choices. Through the experience, Daniel also learned something profound about himself and his role in the community. Being a sheriff was not just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding people, recognizing circumstances, and making decisions that balanced justice with humanity. He realized that moral courage often required risk, that empathy could be as powerful as authority, and that guiding someone toward freedom sometimes meant challenging conventional expectations. Marcus's transformation, though only beginning, already reflected the power of these choices. He attended counseling sessions, participated in community projects, and began building relationships with mentors who encouraged positive behavior and decision-making. He started seeing a future in which mistakes did not define him, where growth and learning were possible, and where the support of caring adults could make a lasting difference. The sheriff's belief in him had become a foundation for this change, proving that guidance, accountability, and opportunity could coexist. The climax of the story, the trial, the decision, and the shift in Marcus's life, was more than a single event. It was a turning point that illustrated the complexity of justice, the importance of moral courage, and the potential for change when empathy guides action. Daniel Whitaker had faced a choice that could have defined him negatively, but he chose to act with integrity, balance, and compassion. The result was a young life redirected, a community challenged to see beyond strict rules, and a sheriff reaffirmed in the belief that justice is most meaningful when it is human.
As the weeks passed, Marcus began to thrive.
The boy who had entered the sheriff's office timid and uncertain now carried himself with cautious confidence. He understood that freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, guidance, and responsibility. Daniel watched this transformation with a sense of pride, tempered by humility. He knew that he had not saved Marcus alone. The boy's effort, family support, and community involvement were all crucial, but his choice had provided the critical opportunity for growth. In the quiet moments, Daniel reflected on the journey and the lessons learned. The trial had been the climax, the moment of highest tension and decision, but it was also a beginning. The sheriff understood that true impact often came after the decisive moment, in the slow, patient work of support, guidance, and encouragement. Marcus's story was far from over, but the most dangerous chapter, one that could have led to irreversible consequences, had been avoided. Justice, tempered with empathy, had prevailed. The weeks following the trial were filled with small, steady changes. Pine Ridge had returned to its usual rhythm. The children's laughter in the streets, the hum of cars on the main road, and neighbors greeting one another on their porches. Yet beneath this familiar surface, life had shifted for Marcus Hayes and Sheriff Daniel Whitaker. For Marcus, the court's decision had been a second chance, one he could not take lightly. He knew that freedom was not just about leaving the courthouse, but about proving to himself, his family, and his community that he could make the right choices from that moment forward. Each day began with structure. Marcus followed a schedule that included school, counseling sessions, and community service. At first, it was difficult. The weight of responsibility felt heavy, and the shadow of his past mistake loomed over him. But gradually, he started to see the purpose behind the rules. Cleaning up the local park, helping at the community center, and volunteering for town events were not just obligations. They were opportunities to build trust and demonstrate growth. Every small success gave him confidence, and every challenge taught him patience, persistence, and accountability. His mother watched these changes with cautious hope. She had spent many sleepless nights worrying, wondering if Marcus would find his way or repeat the mistakes of others in the family. Now, seeing him return home each day with a sense of purpose and pride, she allowed herself to hope again. Their evenings were quieter than before, but richer in conversation. They spoke about school projects, community work, and dreams for the future. Marcus began to open up in ways he had not before, sharing thoughts and concerns he had kept hidden. Slowly, the bond between mother and son strengthened, healing some of the strain that had accumulated over the years. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker, meanwhile, continued his role not just as a lawman but as a mentor and guide. He visited Marcus regularly, checking on his progress, offering advice, and encouraging him to reflect on his decisions. Daniel's presence was steady but unobtrusive, a reminder that someone believed in Marcus's potential, even when the boy doubted himself. Through these visits, the sheriff also reflected on his own growth. He had always prided himself on enforcing the law, but this experience had taught him that justice was more than rules. It was understanding people, circumstances, and the opportunity to guide them toward better choices. Marcus's interactions with mentors and community members became pivotal. He learned practical skills, like basic financial management, time organization, and communication, as well as life lessons about empathy, responsibility, and resilience. Every task, every project, every session of counseling reinforced the idea that actions had consequences, but that mistakes could be transformed into learning opportunities. He began to see himself not just as a boy who had made a mistake, but as a young person capable of growth, contribution, and leadership. The town of Pine Ridge also began to notice these changes. Neighbors who had once whispered about Marcus now nodded in recognition of his efforts. Teachers acknowledged his improved behavior and focus in class. Community members who had been skeptical of the sheriff's decision began to understand the value of guidance and second chances. Slowly, the boy who had been judged harshly by circumstances became a symbol of growth, perseverance. Daniel watched these developments with a mixture of pride and humility. He knew that his advocacy had created the opportunity, but the real work belonged to Marcus and his family. The sheriff had learned that leadership was not about making decisions in isolation. It was about fostering an environment where people could rise above their mistakes and reach their potential. The experience had reshaped Daniel's understanding of justice, responsibility, and the power of human connection. The story of Marcus's transformation was not without challenges. There were moments of doubt, times when setbacks threatened to undo progress. Some community projects were difficult, some mentoring sessions frustrating. Marcus occasionally felt the urge to retreat into old habits, and Daniel had to remind him of the importance of persistence, reflection, and accountability. But each challenge became an opportunity to practice resilience. Marcus learned that growth was not a straight line, but a series of steps forward, and lessons learned from missteps along the way. Through the months, Marcus began to take initiative. He proposed ideas for community projects, sought out opportunities to help younger children avoid the mistakes he had made, and even began tutoring peers struggling with schoolwork. The boy who had entered the sheriff's office timid and uncertain now carried himself with cautious confidence, aware of his responsibilities and proud of his accomplishments. His relationship with his mother deepened, strengthened by trust, communication, and shared purpose. Together, they began to imagine a future in which Marcus could pursue his dreams without being defined by a single mistake. For Daniel, the aftermath of the trial became a period of reflection and quiet satisfaction. He continued his work as sheriff, but his perspective had shifted. Authority alone was not enough. Guidance, empathy, and moral courage were equally important. He found fulfillment in witnessing Marcus's growth and understanding that justice was not just about punishment, but about creating opportunities for people to learn, change, and contribute positively to their community. The sheriff realized that each decision carried weight far beyond the immediate consequences, and that choosing compassion and guidance could leave a lasting impact. As the first year after the trial came to a close, Marcus had made remarkable progress. His school grades improved. He maintained his commitments to counseling and community service, and he began to dream about the future in ways he had never allowed himself before. Daniel observed these changes with quiet pride, knowing that the boy's transformation was a testament to effort, support, and the willingness of someone in authority to believe in human potential. Marcus's journey had become a story not only of personal growth, but also of the power of empathy, mentorship, and opportunity. The sheriff also began to see the broader impact of his choice. Other young people in the town who had faced challenges began to receive more guidance and support, inspired by Marcus's progress. Teachers, counselors, and community leaders recognized the importance of intervention, mentorship, and structured opportunities. Pine Ridge gradually embraced a culture that balanced accountability with understanding, showing that change was possible when individuals worked together to support growth rather than simply punish mistakes. In quiet moments, Daniel reflected on the journey that had begun with Marcus's mistake. He thought about the choices he had faced, the sleepless nights, and the moral challenges. He realized that true justice was complex, requiring courage, empathy, and a willingness to act beyond the letter of the law. Marcus's success reinforced the idea that one person's decision could change the trajectory of a life, and perhaps even influence the community in meaningful ways. Marcus, for his part, carried the lessons of the past with him. He understood the weight of mistakes, the importance of responsibility, and the value of support and guidance. He no longer viewed himself as a victim of circumstance, but as an active participant in shaping his future. Each day became an opportunity to demonstrate growth, contribute positively, and prove that a single mistake did not define him. His journey from fear and uncertainty to hope and purpose became a living example of resilience and transformation. The sheriff and the boy maintained their connection, though it evolved over time. Daniel became a mentor who offered guidance when needed, but also allowed Marcus to take responsibility and make decisions for himself. Their relationship was built on trust, respect, and shared understanding. The sheriff had learned as much from Marcus as the boy had learned from him: the power of second chances, the impact of moral courage, and the importance of human connection in guiding individuals toward better paths. By the time a year had passed, Marcus had become a positive presence in Pine Ridge. His efforts in the community were recognized, his school performance continued to improve, and his relationships with family and peers strengthened. The town began to see the value of patience, guidance, and the importance of offering opportunities for growth rather than simply enforcing punishment. Marcus's story became a quiet inspiration, a reminder that change was possible when people were given support, understanding, and the chance to take responsibility for their actions. Daniel, looking back on the events, realized that the experience had reshaped not only Marcus's life, but his own understanding of justice and leadership. Being sheriff was no longer just about enforcing rules. It was about fostering growth, guiding potential, and making decisions that reflected both the law and humanity. He had faced a moral test, made a courageous choice, and witnessed the transformative power of empathy, mentorship, and opportunity. The experience would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that true impact often came from balancing authority with compassion. Marcus had come full circle, from fear and uncertainty to confidence and purpose. His journey from chains to freedom was more than a legal release. It was a transformation of character, understanding, and opportunity. He had learned the value of responsibility, the importance of guidance, and the power of human connection. And for Daniel, seeing Marcus thrive was a reminder that moral courage, empathy, and thoughtful intervention could change lives in profound and lasting ways. The story of Marcus Hayes and Sheriff Daniel Whitaker became a quiet legacy in Pine Ridge. It was not celebrated with fanfare or headlines, but lived in the daily lives of the people involved. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of second chances. Marcus's life was no longer defined by a single mistake. It was shaped by choices, growth, and the belief that every person given opportunity and guidance could rise above their circumstances and contribute positively to the world around them.